The letter arrived on a Tuesday in the spring of 1882, and by Friday Julia Fletcher had already made up her mind to do something most women in Caldwell, Kansas would have called foolish, reckless, and entirely unbecoming of a widow. She had sent for a man. Not just any man, a hired hand. A ranch foreman specifically recommended by her late husband's cousin down in Abilene. A steady fellow by the name of Carter Hale who supposedly knew cattle, fences, irrigation ditches, and the particular stubbornness of sunburned prairie soil. She needed someone who understood all of those things, because her 40-acre spread north of Caldwell was 3 months behind on every task that mattered. Her 2 remaining field hands had quit in February when the pay ran thin, and the bank in town was beginning to send letters that no longer began with "Dear Mrs. Fletcher," but instead began with "In the matter of the outstanding balance." She was 28 years old. She had a son named Henry who was 6 and had his father's eyes and her father's laugh. She had a house that needed a new roof on the western side, a herd of 31 cattle that had dwindled from 52 over a single hard winter, a well that was beginning to taste of iron, and a heart that had been so thoroughly dried out by grief and labor, and worry that she had almost forgotten it was still beating. She was not looking for love. She was looking for a competent ranch foreman. The stagecoach from Abilene was due into Caldwell on the second Thursday of May. Julia had arranged for Carter Hale to be on it, had sent him traveling money and a brief letter of instruction, had told him that she would be waiting at the station with a wagon and that she expected a man who could start work within 24 hours of arriving. She had been very clear about that. She did not have time for courtesies or long introductions. She needed the fences mended before the cattle drifted into her neighbor Aldous Pruett's fields again, because Pruett was already looking at her land with the kind of patient hunger that men like him always reserved for widows who were running low on options. She arrived at the Caldwell stage station at 2:30 on a warm Thursday afternoon, Henry sitting beside her on the wagon bench, his small legs swinging, his hat too large for his head because it had been his father's and he refused to wear any other. The stagecoach arrived 12 minutes late, which the station master announced with the resigned air of a man who had stopped being surprised by anything. 3 passengers stepped down, a traveling merchant with 2 enormous cases of dry goods, an older woman in black who was clearly coming to bury someone and already looked as though the task had been done to her instead, and then a man. He was not Carter Hale. Julia knew it the moment she saw him, because her husband's cousin had described Carter Hale as a short, barrel-chested fellow with red hair and a disposition that ran toward cheerful. This man was none of those things. He was tall, lean in the way that suggested he had been tested by weather and work and not found wanting. His hair was dark, the color of creek water in shadow, and it curled slightly at the collar of a shirt that had been washed so many times it had gone from whatever its original color was to a particular shade of brown that the sun and dust of the open plains tend to produce. His hat was pushed back on his head as if he had been thinking hard about something and had absent-mindedly shoved it there while doing so. His jaw was unshaved, not in the careless way, but in the way of a man who had been traveling for 3 days and had more important things to attend to than a razor. He had a worn leather saddlebag over one shoulder and a bedroll under his arm. He stepped down from the coach and stood in the afternoon light and looked around Caldwell the way a man does when he is arriving somewhere for the first time and is deciding very quickly whether it is the kind of place that will treat him fairly or the kind that will make him sorry he came. Julia climbed down from the wagon. "Excuse me," she said, walking toward the man. "I am looking for Carter Hale. Were you on the coach from Abilene? Do you know if he was meant to be traveling today?" The man looked at her directly, and she noticed that his eyes were gray, the kind of gray that had a little green somewhere in the depth of it, like lichen on old stone. He had a steadiness to his gaze that she was not entirely prepared for. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice was low, unhurried, the kind of voice that did not raise itself to make a point but was clearly accustomed to being listened to. "Carter Hale broke his collarbone 3 days ago. Horse threw him. He's laid up in Abilene and won't be working for at least 2 months, maybe more. He sent a telegram to let you know, but I suspect it didn't arrive before I did." Julia stared at him. She felt something cold settle into her chest that had nothing to do with the weather. "Who are you?" she said. "Noah Conroy," he said. He did not extend his hand immediately, as if he understood that this was not quite the moment for that. "I've been working Carter's crew for the past 2 years. He asked me to come in his place and explain the situation directly, since he knew the telegram might not reach you in time. He also said," he paused, and something shifted in his expression, something careful and honest at the same time. "He said that if you needed the work done, I could do it. He told me what your situation was. He said you needed someone who knew cattle and fencing and didn't ask too many questions about wages that might be light the first season." Julia looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked back at the wagon, where Henry had twisted around on the bench and was watching with large, solemn eyes. She looked at the station master, who had already retreated into his little booth and had no interest in being involved in anyone's troubles. She looked at the letter in her coat pocket, the one from the bank. "Do you have references," she said flatly, "beyond Carter Hale's recommendation?" "I do," he said. He reached into the saddlebag without hurry and produced a folded paper. She opened it. It was a letter from a rancher named Elias Drummond out of Dodge City, written in the careful hand of a man who did not write often but chose his words well when he did. It said that Noah Conroy had worked his outfit for 3 years before that he was honest, capable, did not drink to excess or start fights, and had turned a struggling herd of 40 cattle into a functioning operation of nearly 200 before a drought had forced the Drummond family to sell and scatter. She folded the letter and handed it back. "You can sleep in the bunkhouse," she said. "It is small and needs a new door latch. The pay is $12 a month to start, with meals provided. If the operation improves, we discuss more in the fall. I need the north fence line repaired before anything else, and I need an honest assessment of the herd's condition within the first week." Noah Conroy looked at her for a moment. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She turned and walked back to the wagon. She helped Henry straighten his oversized hat and climbed up to the bench and clicked the horse forward. Behind her, she heard the soft thud of a saddlebag being placed in the wagon bed, and then the creak of the wood as Noah climbed up and settled himself at the far end of the bench, a careful and respectful distance between himself and the widow and her small boy. Henry looked up at the tall stranger with the dark hair. "Are you the new ranch man?" he asked. "Looks like," Noah said. Henry considered this with the gravity of a 6-year-old who has recently decided he is responsible for things. "My father died," he said. "In the winter, he got sick." "I'm sorry to hear that," Noah said. "Mama says we have to be strong now," Henry said, "because that's what he would have wanted." Noah was quiet for a moment. "Your mama sounds like she's right," he said. Henry seemed satisfied with that. He turned back to watch the road. Julia kept her eyes forward and her hands firm on the reins, and did not let herself think about anything beyond the 12 miles between Caldwell and home. The Fletcher ranch sat on a wide roll of prairie where the land leveled out after a long, gentle slope from the south. There was a creek that ran good in spring and slowed to a trickle in August, a stand of cottonwoods along the eastern edge that provided the only real shade for half a mile in any direction, and a house that had been built with genuine care and had suffered 2 years of insufficient upkeep. The porch railing was loose on the left side. The barn needed paint. The bunkhouse, which Julia had described accurately, was small and had a door latch that had been broken since October and had been secured with a length of wire ever since. Noah did not comment on any of this that first evening. He put his things in the bunkhouse, came to the kitchen door when Julia called that supper was ready, ate without excessive compliment or complaint, answered her direct questions with direct answers, and after supper asked if he could walk the fence line before dark to begin getting a sense of what needed doing first. She said yes. She watched him go from the kitchen window, his long stride unhurried, his shadow stretching long and thin across the grass in the last of the evening light, and she told herself she was watching to make sure he did not help himself to anything that was not his. She did not examine whether that was the whole truth. The following morning he was up before she was. She came down to the kitchen at 5:30 to start the stove and found that the stove was already going, a pot of coffee already hot. He was not in the kitchen, but she could hear him outside, the sound of a hammer, steady and rhythmic, and when she looked out she saw him repairing the split rail of the fence nearest the barn, working with the focused economy of someone who knew what they were doing and saw no reason to make it look harder than it was. She poured herself a cup of coffee and stood at the window. She did not know what to do with this. She had arranged for a competent stranger, and she had received one. But Carter Hale was cheerful and barrel-chested and red-haired, and would have felt like a hired hand in the way she was accustomed to hired hands feeling. Noah Conroy felt like something else, though she could not yet say what, and that lack of certainty unsettled her in a way she did not entirely welcome. Over the first 2 weeks he repaired the north fence line, replaced the door latch on the bunkhouse with a proper iron piece he found in the tool shed, assessed the herd, and delivered a written report. She had not expected it to be written, had expected a spoken summary, and the neat, careful handwriting on 3 pages of her spare paper surprised her more than anything else so far. That identified which cattle were in sound health, which needed watching, and which 2 needed to be separated from the herd immediately. His assessment matched her own observations so precisely that she found herself standing in the kitchen rereading his report a second time for no practical reason. Henry had attached himself to Noah with the frank and unsentimental devotion of a small boy who has been missing male company, without fully understanding that he was missing it. He followed Noah through the barn in the mornings, asking questions at a pace and volume that could have tried a patient person. Noah answered each one seriously, without condescension, without hurrying the child along, and without any of the performative fondness that Julia had seen adults use with children when they were really talking to the parent over the child's head. She noticed this. She noticed more than she meant to. She also noticed that he never pushed past the particular line of distance that she had not drawn explicitly, but that he had understood perfectly from the first day. He was respectful without being formal to the point of coldness. He was present without being intrusive. He did not offer opinions about how she ran the ranch unless she asked, and when she asked, he gave them plainly. He did not look at her the way some men looked at widows, the way that calculated loneliness and land and livestock all in the same glance. Or if he did, she could not catch him at it. Aldous Pruett came by on the 18th day. Pruett was a thick-necked man in his late 40s who owned the 600 acres adjacent to the Fletcher land and had been acquiring surrounding parcels steadily for 3 years. He was not threatening in any direct way. He was the kind of man who was careful to be polite, careful to be reasonable, careful to ensure that any pressure he applied came from circumstances and not from anything that could be pointed to directly as his doing. He arrived in a nice buggy with a nice horse and a nice hat, and sat in Julia's parlor and drank her tea, and told her that he was concerned about her situation, as a neighbor, as a friend of her late husband's, which was a stretch, since her late husband Thomas Fletcher had not cared for Pruett but had been too well-mannered to say so plainly, and that if she found herself in need of a fair offer for the land, he wanted her to know his door was always open. Julia sat across from him with her hands in her lap and her face composed and told him she appreciated his concern and had no plans to sell. Pruett smiled in the way that men smile when they believe time is on their side. After he left, Julia sat for a moment in the empty parlor. Then she went out to the barn where Noah was working on the hinges of the east door. Aldous Pruett was here, she said. Noah turned from the hinge. I saw his buggy, he said. He wants to buy the land. Yes, Noah said, as if that was already clear. He'll keep coming, Julia said. She was not asking. Noah looked at her steadily. He'll keep coming, he agreed. Unless the operation looks healthy enough that there's no vulnerability for him to wait on. And does it look healthy enough, she said. He was quiet for a moment, honest rather than reassuring. Not yet, he said. Give it a full season. She nodded. She turned to go back to the house. Mrs. Fletcher, he said. She stopped. The bank letters, he said. How many months behind? She stiffened. She had not told him about the bank letters. She turned back slowly. You've seen them, she said. It was not quite an accusation. They were on the kitchen table when I came in for coffee one morning, he said. I didn't read them closely, but I saw enough. She held his gaze. 3 months, she said. Possibly 4 by the time the next payment is due. He nodded. He turned back to the hinge. All right, he said, as though this was simply the next piece of information, and he was filing it in the same place as the condition of the fence and the composition of the herd. She stood there for a moment, and something in her chest shifted slightly, like a stone that had been lodged in one place for a long time and had just moved a 1/4 inch. She did not name it. She went back to the house. June came in with a run of heat that made everything shimmer and turned the prairie grass to the color of old straw. Noah had taken on the task of working with the remaining herd with a systematic patience that was beginning to show results. He had identified 2 calves that would be worth selling in Caldwell before the end of summer at a fair price, had negotiated with the general store in town for a credit arrangement for fence supplies that shaved a considerable amount off what Julia had been paying through the bank's supply service, and had repaired the western side of the roof on a Saturday morning while Julia and Henry were at church. She came home to find the western roof repaired. She stood and looked at it for a moment. When Noah came in for the midday meal, she said, "You didn't have to do the roof. It was leaking into the bedroom wall," he said. "I could see the stain from the outside." He sat down at the table and she put a plate in front of him. "I had the materials left over from the barn repairs. It didn't cost anything." She sat down across from him and Henry sat between them and talked about a grasshopper he had found that morning with extraordinary enthusiasm. And for a while the 3 of them simply ate, and the sound of Henry's voice filled the room, and outside the wind moved across the grass, and the cottonwoods threw their moving shadows across the yard, and it was, Julia realized with a jolt that went through her like cold water, the most peaceful she had felt inside her own house in over a year. She picked up her fork and focused very hard on her food. Later that evening, when Henry was in bed and the house had gone quiet, Julia sat on the porch in the cooling air with a cup of tea. Noah was sitting on the bunkhouse step, not far away, mending a piece of tack by lamplight. They had fallen into a habit of this without either of them arranging it, being in the same general vicinity in the evenings without being in direct company, close enough to speak if something needed saying, far enough to be properly separate. The coyotes were calling out across the dark flat miles of prairie. The stars over Kansas were extravagant, the kind that city people never saw. "Where did you come from before Abilene?" Julia said. He looked up from the tack. There was a brief pause, the kind that is not hesitation but rather the pause of a man who is deciding how much of something to give. "Texas, originally," he said. "East Texas. My family had a small farm there. After my father died, I went west. Worked cattle drives through the 70s, then settled into ranch management work." "Did you never want your own land?" she said. He looked at the tack for a moment. "I thought about it," he said. "It never came together the right way." "What does that mean?" He was quiet again. "It means the things that were supposed to happen didn't happen the way I expected," he said. "There was a woman once. She chose differently." He said it simply, without bitterness or the ostentatious stoicism of a man advertising his wound. Just a fact, placed down like a stone. Julia looked out at the dark prairie. "I did not expect to be alone either," she said. "Thomas and I had plans." "He was a good man," Noah said. It was said with the quiet certainty of someone who has learned enough about a person through their effects to form an honest opinion. Julia looked at him. "You know that from being here 3 weeks," she said. "I know it from the way Henry talks about him," he said, "and from the way you run this place. A bad man doesn't leave a woman like you or a house like this behind. She was not prepared for that. She felt something move in her face and she was glad of the dark. She looked away. "Go to sleep, Mr. Conroy," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected. "Good night, Mrs. Fletcher," he said. She heard the creak of the bunkhouse door and then the quiet, and she sat with her tea and the stars and the coyotes and her own racing, unruly, entirely inconvenient heart, and she told it firmly to be still. It did not listen. July brought two things: a cattle inspection from the bank's appointed assessor, a narrow-faced man named Greer who arrived in Caldwell on behalf of the bank to evaluate whether the Fletcher operation was a viable concern or a declining one, and a dance at the Caldwell Community Hall that the whole county attended, because summer was long and reasons to celebrate were valuable. The bank inspection came first. Greer arrived on a Monday morning and spent 3 hours walking the land with a notebook and a demeanor of preemptive disappointment. Noah accompanied them on Julia's invitation, and she was quietly grateful for this because Greer asked technical questions about herd health and pasture rotation and fence standards that she could answer, but that Noah answered with a fluency and specificity that shifted Greer's demeanor from preemptive disappointment to something more like reluctant recalibration. When Greer departed at noon, he told Julia that he would be filing his report with the bank, and that while the operation showed notable challenges, it also showed evidence of competent management and reasonable growth trajectory, which, translated from bank assessor language, meant that they were not going to foreclose immediately. Julia stood in the yard and watched his horse carry him back toward town, and she breathed out slowly and let her shoulders come down from where they had been since 7 that morning, which was somewhere around her ears. That was better than it could have been, she said. Noah was beside her, not close but beside her. "Yes," he said, "2 more months and it'll be better still." She turned to look at him. He had a slight smear of dust across his jaw from where he had run his hand through his beard while answering one of Greer's questions, and his hair was disordered from the wind, and he was looking down the road after Greer's departing horse with the calm forward focus of a man who has already moved on to the next thing that needs doing. She wanted to say something to him. She was not sure what. She said, "Thank you." He looked at her then, and something shifted in his expression, something brief and careful, and she thought surprised, as if he had not expected the gratitude, or perhaps had not expected the way she was looking at him when she offered it. "You did the work," he said. "I just know how to talk about it to men like Greer. That," she said, "is also a form of work. Not everything is fixed with a hammer." The corner of his mouth moved. It was the closest thing to a smile she had seen from him, and it did something entirely unfair to the inside of her chest. She went back into the house. The community dance was that Saturday. Julia almost did not go. She had been to very few social events since Thomas died. Not out of strict mourning observance, it had been 14 months, which was past the hardest part of what people expected, but out of a particular exhaustion with being the recipient of other people's sympathy, which always had an edge to it, always carried the unspoken assessment of her circumstances and her prospects that she found tiring. But Mary Sutton, who was Julia's closest friend in Caldwell and had been since they were girls in the same schoolroom, came by on Thursday and said that Julia was going to that dance if she had to personally saddle the horse and pack the wagon herself. Mary was small and blonde and had a will of iron wrapped in a manner so cheerful that you never quite saw the iron until it was already applied to you, and Julia found she did not have the energy to resist. She put on the blue dress that she had not worn since the previous Christmas and pinned her hair up and felt, looking in the small bedroom mirror, like someone slightly different from the person she had been for the past 14 months. Someone who was still there, underneath the work and the worry. Henry was going to stay with Mary's family for the night, and Julia drove the wagon into town alone, because she had not thought to ask anyone to drive with her, and Noah had said nothing about the dance, and asking him felt like a thing she was not prepared to parse the meaning of, so she had simply not done it. She arrived at the community hall to find it bright with lantern light, and loud with fiddle music, and fuller than it had any right to be given that the entire county had also spent the week dealing with the July heat. She found Mary immediately, and was immediately swept into a series of conversations and introductions, and was twice asked to dance by men she knew slightly. And she danced with both of them because it would have been rude not to, and because Mary was watching her with the expression of someone who has decided that their friend is going to enjoy herself whether she intends to or not. She was standing near the refreshment table, slightly warm from dancing, talking to Mary and Mary's husband Carl about nothing in particular, when the door opened and Noah Conroy walked in. She had not known he was coming. She did not know why she was surprised. He was a man who lived and worked in Caldwell County. He had every right to attend a community dance. He had cleaned himself up. She noticed with entirely unwelcome attention to detail, shaved, hair combed, wearing a dark shirt that fit him better than his work clothes and made him look like someone who was not, in fact, perpetually composed of sunlight and dust. He saw her approximately 2 seconds after she saw him. He did not smile or wave or do anything demonstrative. He simply gave a small, acknowledging nod, the kind that meant "I see you and I am not going to make anything of it," and then turned to accept a cup of something from the refreshment table near the door. Mary had noticed. Mary had the observational powers of a hawk and the social instincts of someone who had been managing the dynamics of a small community for 30 years. "Is that your new ranch hand?" Mary said, at a volume calibrated precisely so that only Julia could hear it. "Ranch foreman," Julia said, "and yes." "He is not what I expected," Mary said. "What did you expect?" "Someone who looked more like a ranch foreman and less like that," Mary said. "Mary," Julia said. "I'm just observing," Mary said, in the serene voice of someone who is doing considerably more than observing. The fiddle struck up a waltz, which in 1882 in a Kansas County dance meant something approximating a waltz, adjusted for the particular energies of people who had been working hard all week and were determined to have a good time tonight. Carl pulled Mary onto the floor immediately. Julia found herself at the edge of the dancing space, watching. She felt him before she saw him move, which made no logical sense, and which she filed away to be concerned about later. "Mrs. Fletcher," Noah said from just behind her left shoulder. She turned. He was holding 2 cups of the sweet lemonade the Hendersons always brought to these events. He offered her one. "I wasn't going to come," he said. Then it seemed he stopped. He seemed to be editing something. It seemed better to come than to sit in the bunkhouse on a Saturday night. "Yes," she said. She took the lemonade. "That seems reasonable." They stood together at the edge of the floor and watched the dancing, and it was strange how natural it was to stand beside him, how the particular quality of silence between them was not uncomfortable but filled with something she could not name, something warm and present. "Do you dance?" she asked. "Poorly," he said. "I find that hard to believe," she said. "You do most things well." She said it before she had fully considered whether to say it, and it landed between them with a small weight. He looked at her and she looked at him, and there was a moment that lasted perhaps 3 seconds and contained something that could not be stuffed back into the space it had come from. "May I?" he said. She set her lemonade down on the table. "Yes," she said. He danced better than poorly. He danced with the same careful, present attention that he brought to everything, and he held her at a proper distance, and led clearly, and she followed easily, and around them the hall was bright and loud and spinning. But within the small circumference of the dance it was just this: the warmth of his hand at her waist, his other hand holding hers, the smell of soap and something warmer underneath, the steadiness of his gaze that she could feel even when she was looking past his shoulder. When the music ended, they stepped apart, both slightly more careful with each other after that, both slightly more aware of what they were being careful about. She danced twice more that evening with other men, because that was the appropriate thing, and when she looked for Noah she found him leaning against the wall talking quietly with 2 ranchers she knew by name, and he glanced at her once across the hall with that same composed gray gaze, and she looked away first and thought, clearly and with some alarm, "I am in considerable trouble." She drove home alone in the warm night, the stars huge over the open prairie, the horse knowing the road well enough that she barely had to guide her, and she sat with her hands on the reins and her thoughts moving in ways she would have preferred they didn't. Thomas had been gone 14 months. She had loved him genuinely and well, and his absence was still a shape in the house that she walked around. She had not thought about loving anyone else. She had not thought there was room for it or time for it, or that she was the kind of woman who would find herself standing at the edge of a dance floor feeling things about a man she had known for 7 weeks. She was, apparently, that kind of woman. She arrived home, put the horse in the barn, and went to bed, and lay in the dark for a long time listening to the coyotes and the creek and the distant, comfortable sound of the land. August was the month that everything began to shift, and it shifted in the way that things shift when two people have been carefully not acknowledging something, and the effort of not acknowledging it begins to cost too much. It started with small things. The way he would come to the kitchen door in the evenings and lean against the frame while she finished up, and they would talk about the ranch, and somehow the ranch talk always stretched past when the ranch talk was strictly necessary, and neither of them remarked on this. The way Henry had taken to climbing into the wagon beside Noah on trips to town for supplies, and the way Noah always had a hand ready when Henry needed to scramble down, and the way Julia watched this with something tightening in her throat. The way she found herself thinking about the sound of his voice at odd moments, while she was making biscuits or mending Henry's shirts or standing at the well in the morning air. It shifted significantly on a particular Wednesday in the middle of August, when the temperature had gone past what was bearable, and the creek was down to its summer leanness, and Julia had been fighting with the irrigation ditch calculation since morning, and had finally come out to where Noah was working on the water system along the eastern pasture, because she needed another set of eyes on what she was trying to figure out. She knelt down in the dry grass beside the ditch and spread the map she had drawn of the water system, weighted at the corners with stones. Noah crouched across from her. She explained what she was trying to solve. He listened, asked 2 questions, picked up the pencil she had brought and marked 3 adjustments to the flow pattern on the map, and then looked up at her. Their faces were closer than they had been outside of the dance. The math of crouching over a map on the ground had reduced the careful distance they usually maintained. She could see the small lines at the corners of his eyes that came from years of squinting into sun and wind. She could see a small scar along his jaw that she had not noticed before. She did not move back. She should have moved back. She stayed exactly where she was, and so did he. "That should solve the drainage problem through September," he said, and his voice was slightly different, she noticed, slightly more careful than usual. "Yes," she said, "I think you're right." Neither of them moved for a moment that went on longer than it should have. Then Henry's voice rang out from across the field, "Mama, Mama, there's a hawk on the fence post." And they both straightened up, and the map's corner stones tumbled, and Noah picked them up and handed the map back, and they went back to being separate people, slightly flushed from the heat, both attentive to the important matter of the hawk on the fence post. That night she could not sleep. She lay in her bed and stared at the ceiling and had a long, honest conversation with herself. She liked this man. She liked him in a way that was not simply gratitude for his competence or relief at having capable help. She liked the particular quality of his attention, the way he treated her son, the way he had come to her defense before Pruitt without making it into something dramatic, the way he had written that assessment report in neat, careful handwriting without being asked. She liked his voice, and she liked his eyes, and she liked the way he was in the world, which was quietly and honestly and without pretension. She was also aware that he had come to her as an employee, that the situation was uneven, that she could not know whether whatever she suspected she saw in his eyes was real or projected. She was aware that she had a son and a ranch in precarious condition, and a bank that was watching her closely, and a neighbor who wanted her land, and that she did not have the luxury of being wrong about something like this. She was also aware, less comfortably, that life was short and the prairie was wide, and that Thomas, of all people, would have been the first to tell her that being frightened of her own heart was not the same as being prudent about it. She went to sleep at some point past midnight, having resolved nothing except that she was going to continue being careful and reasonable, and that she was probably going to fail at both. September came, and with it something unexpected: rain. Good, soaking, week-long rain that filled the creek back up and softened the ground and brought the grass back. Noah had prepared for it, had been watching the sky and the wind patterns, and had made adjustments to the drainage system and the herd positioning in the week before it arrived. And because of this, the Fletcher ranch came through the rain in considerably better shape than several neighboring operations, including two that had poorly positioned cattle and flooding in low pastures. The calves sold well at the September market in Caldwell. Better than Julia had projected, because Noah had timed the sale with the particular attention to market cycles that Julia had learned he possessed, having spent a decade moving cattle and understanding the rhythms of buyers and prices. The sale covered the 3 months of bank payments that had been outstanding and made a start on the 4th, and when Julia came out of the bank's local office on the main street of Caldwell on a Thursday afternoon with a receipt showing a zero-balance current account, she stood on the wooden boardwalk in the mild September air and felt something unknot inside her chest that had been knotted for 2 years. Noah was waiting by the wagon. He had driven her in that day and was leaning against the side of the wagon reading a copy of the Caldwell Post that he had picked up while she was in the bank. He looked up when she came down the boardwalk steps. He read her face. "Current," he said. "Current," she said. He nodded. Something moved in his expression, something warm that he did not quite suppress fast enough. He folded the paper. "Good," he said. She stood in front of him, and the October end of September sunshine was warm on her back, and Main Street was doing its ordinary Thursday business around them, and she said, "I could not have done this without you, Noah." She had used his first name. She had not done that before. It came out before she could weigh it. He went very still for a moment. Then he said quietly, "Yes, you could have. You would have found a way." "Maybe," she said, "but not this fast, not this cleanly." He looked at her, and there was a quality to the silence between them that had been building for weeks and was now at a particular pressure, and she was aware of the boardwalk under her feet and the sound of the street and the particular golden quality of the September light, and she thought, "If he doesn't say something, I am going to have to, and if I have to, then I am going to." He said, "Julia," and stopped. She waited. "I want to be clear about something," he said. He was choosing his words very carefully, the way he chose everything when it mattered. "I know I work for you. I know the situation. I don't want to say anything that makes this difficult or that you feel you can't answer honestly because of what it might mean for the arrangement." He looked at her with that steady gray-green gaze. "But I would like to know if I am wrong about what I think I've been seeing." She held his gaze. Her heart was moving at a speed entirely inappropriate for a boardwalk on a Thursday afternoon. "You are not wrong," she said. Something happened to his face then. It was not dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic. It was the slow, careful arrival of something that had been kept at a long distance, something warm and real, like light through a window that has finally been unshuttered after a long winter. "All right," he said, very quietly. "All right," she said. Neither of them said anything else on the subject for the drive home, because Henry was in the back of the wagon talking at considerable length about a story he had heard at the schoolhouse about a buffalo stampede, and the world required them to be in it, and neither of them minded. The drive home felt different, though. The 12 miles felt like something they were sharing rather than simply traversing. That evening, after Henry was in bed, Julia came out onto the porch. Noah was already there, which surprised her and then did not. He had brought 2 cups of coffee, which he sometimes did on cooler evenings now. She sat in the porch chair and he sat on the top step, and the stars came out over the prairie in their extravagant way, and the creek spoke its quiet September language from the eastern edge of the property. "Tell me about Texas," she said. He looked up at the sky for a moment. "East Texas was green," he said. "More trees than you'd believe if all you know is Kansas. My father grew corn and kept a few pigs, and there were 3 of us boys. I was the middle one." He was quiet a moment. "He was a good man, my father. He worked himself to death by the time I was 17, which is what happens to men who work that kind of land with no capital and no help. I left because staying would have meant watching my mother and brothers struggle and being one more body to feed." "Was that the right choice?" she asked. "I've been asking myself that for 15 years, he said. "My mother passed in 78. My brothers settled and did all right. I went west and went wider, and sometimes it felt like running away, and sometimes it felt like the only honest thing." "What does it feel like now?" she said. He looked at her. The porch lamp was between them, warm and soft. "Like arriving," he said. She felt the word settle into her like the first warm thing after a cold stretch, slow and deep and certain. "I was afraid," she said, "after Thomas, not of being alone exactly, more afraid of forgetting what it felt like to be looked at like." She stopped. She found her words. "Like I was the most interesting landscape in the room." "You are," he said, plainly, without performance. She laughed, and it came out unexpected and genuine, and he smiled then, a full smile, not the half-corner thing she had been collecting all these months, and the sight of it did something to her chest that she had entirely given up trying to manage. "Noah," she said. "Yes," he said, as if whatever she was about to say was already agreed to. "I think we should be honest with each other about this," she said, "and careful, for Henry's sake and for practical reasons." "Yes," he said again. "I agree. But I don't want to be so careful that she stopped. "That we miss it," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a long, quiet moment. "We won't miss it," he said. "I'm not going anywhere, Julia." She believed him. She was surprised by how completely she believed him, and then she thought about the quality of his word and the consistency of his action over the past 4 months, and she was not surprised at all. October in Kansas was a season unto itself. The cottonwoods along the creek went gold, and the air went sharp, and the evenings came early, and the sky was the particular deep blue of the time of year when everything is finishing its business before the cold. The ranch was in better shape than it had been in 2 years. Noah had organized the herd into a configuration that would carry them through winter more efficiently, had laid in feed, had repaired the barn interior against drafts, had done a dozen things that constituted the quiet infrastructure of survival in that country. Julia and Noah moved carefully as they had agreed. He did not announce himself as more than the ranch foreman to the community, and she did not correct that understanding. But within the life of the ranch, something had opened between them. They talked in the evenings with the particular ease of 2 people who are no longer managing a careful distance. She learned about the cattle drive years, the long months on the trail through the 70s, the heat and dust and sameness of it, the particular society of cowboys and cowhands that existed nowhere else in the world, and was already changing as the cattle industry changed, as fences went up across the plains, and the open range began its long, slow closing. He learned about her, about growing up on a small farm in Missouri before her family moved to Kansas. About Thomas, whom she talked about more easily now, with the particular quality of memory that has moved past the first sharpness of grief into something cleaner and more honest. About her own stubbornness, which she named plainly and which he received without surprise. About her plans for the ranch, which were more ambitious than she had told the bank or Pruitt or anyone else, because she had been keeping them close while she was afraid they might be taken from her. "I want to expand the herd," she told him one evening in October. They were at the kitchen table after supper, the lamp between them, a map of the property spread out as maps had a habit of doing in their conversations. "Not just to stability. I want 50 cattle by next year, 60 by the year after. I want to run this place as a full operation." Noah looked at the map. He was quiet, working through the logistics. "The north pasture could support it," he said, "if we extend the water access point, and we'd need to take on at least one more permanent hand in the spring." "Can we manage that?" she said. He looked at her. Together, he said, and the word had more in it than ranch management logistics. Together, she said. The first time he kissed her was not contrived or theatrical in the way of such things in novels, which Julia later thought was appropriate, because neither of them was a theatrical kind of person. It was a Thursday evening in the second week of October, and they had been sitting on the porch in the cooling air discussing whether the roan heifer would winter well or needed to be sold before the cold set in. And she had been making the case that the heifer was more resilient than she appeared, and he had been making the counterargument. And at some point she had turned to make a point directly, and he had been closer than she expected, and they had both stopped talking at precisely the same moment, and the particular charged silence of two people who have been not doing something for months was suddenly no longer sustainable. He kissed her gently and briefly, and then moved back slightly, giving her the space to decide what it meant. She decided it meant exactly what it was. She leaned forward and kissed him again, and that one was longer and warmer, and was accompanied by the sound of the creek and the coyotes and the eternal Kansas stars. And when she finally sat back in her porch chair, her heart was conducting itself in a manner entirely unbefitting a practical widow with a functioning cattle ranch. She could not have been more pleased about it. November brought two things that required careful navigation. The first was that Aldous Pruett returned. He had heard about the bank payment, which he had not expected, and his expression when he came to call was less politely patient and somewhat more direct. He sat in the parlor and said, with less ceremony than before, that he would offer a fair price, a generous price, and that the winter ahead was uncertain, and a woman running a ranch alone was a particular kind of exposed. He said the word alone with a particular emphasis. Julia looked at him with a composure she was genuinely feeling, which was a different experience than the composure she had been performing in their previous meeting. "Mr. Pruett," she said, "I am not alone. I have a foreman who has made this operation more productive in 6 months than it has been in 2 years. I have a herd in sound condition, fences in good repair, and a current account at the bank. I have a son who is going to grow up on this land, and I have no intention of selling it to you or to anyone else." Pruett looked at her for a moment. He was recalculating. She could see it. "Conroy," he said. "That's your foreman's name." "It is," she said. "He won't stay," Pruett said, and there was something ugly in it, carefully veiled but present. "Men like that don't stay. You'll be in the same position in a year." "I think," Julia said, standing and indicating the door in a manner that was entirely courteous and entirely immovable, "that you will find you are wrong about that." After Pruett left, she stood in the parlor for a moment, and she noticed that she was not shaking, not afraid, not running the arithmetic of vulnerability. She was steady. She went out to the barn and told Noah what Pruett had said. He was cleaning a bridle and he kept cleaning it, but his jaw had tightened. "He'll try other things," he said. "Let him," she said, and meant it. The second thing November brought was more complex, and it was Henry. Henry had not, in the earlier months, fully understood what was different about the way things were between his mother and Noah. He had accepted Noah's presence with the matter-of-fact adaptability of a young child, and had clearly derived something important from it. But in November he was 6.5, and he had eyes, and he had the particular perceptive intelligence of a child who has spent a lot of time being the only small person in a world of adults. He came to Julia one morning while she was making bread and said, with the directness that was his inheritance from both parents, "Are you and Mr. Conroy going to get married?" Julia went still for a moment, her hands in the dough. She turned and looked at her son, who was watching her with Thomas's eyes and her own composed face. "What makes you ask that?" she said. "Billy Henderson said his mother said you were sweet on the ranch, man," Henry said, "and I saw you kissing on the porch." Julia took a breath. "Henry," she said. "I don't mind," Henry said quickly, and something about the speed of it suggested he had been rehearsing this, had been working out how to say it. "I liked when Papa was here. I miss him. But Mr. Conroy is—" he searched for his word. "Mr. Conroy is good," he said. "He taught me how to check a horse's hoof for stones, and he fixed my fence piece when it broke." Julia's throat did something she had not given it permission to do. She crouched down in front of Henry and looked at him directly. "He is good," she said, "and I do care for him very much. Your father will always be your father, Henry, always. Nothing changes that." Henry nodded with the solemn satisfaction of a child whose important question has been answered honestly. "I know," he said. "Can I have some of the bread dough to make my own roll?" She laughed and pinched off a piece of dough, and he sat at the table and worked it with fierce 6-year-old concentration, and she went back to her bread and thought about what he had said, and about Billy Henderson's mother, and about small towns and how they worked, and she thought, this needs to be done properly then. She told Noah about the conversation that evening. He listened carefully. "He gave you his opinion," Noah said. "He did," Julia said. "He is 6 years old, and he has given me more clarity than I had managed myself." Noah looked at her. They were at the kitchen table again, the evening lamp between them. "Julia," he said, "I want to ask you something." "Ask it," she said. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and she let him, and his hand was warm and work-roughened and entirely steady. "I want to do this correctly," he said. "I know this has been complicated. I know the situation was uneven from the start, and I don't take that lightly. But I need to tell you that I am not here because of the job." He paused, finding his way through what he wanted to say. "I came here for the job. I stayed here for you. And I would like, if you'll have me, to be here for a very long time." She looked at him for a long moment. The lamp flickered in a small draft from the window. Outside, the November wind moved across the prairie in the particular way it had in the beginning of winter, long and steady and deep. "Noah," she said, "I have spent the last 4 months trying very carefully not to let myself need you too much, because I thought needing someone too much was the thing that made you weak." "And now," he said. "Now," she said, "I think I've been confusing needing someone with depending on someone, and I think I have spent enough time alone." He turned her hand over in his and looked at it for a moment, her hand in his, and then he looked up at her. "Will you marry me?" he said. She had expected to need time. She had expected to feel the particular careful anxiety of someone who has lost before and knows what it costs. She did not feel that. She felt instead the particular solid warmth of something right. "Yes," she said. He was very quiet for a moment. Then he brought her hand up and kissed her knuckles, and it was the most careful and tender thing she had ever seen a man do, and she felt it down to the center of her. They were married on the first Saturday of December, 1882, in the small white church in Caldwell, in a service conducted by Reverend Marsh, who did these things simply and well. Mary Sutton and Carl were there. Several other families from the county came. Henry stood beside Noah during the ceremony, having appointed himself to this role without discussion, and wore his father's hat, and was solemn and important about the whole proceeding. Julia wore her blue dress. Noah wore the dark shirt and a jacket he had acquired in Caldwell for the occasion, and he stood in the light of the church windows and looked at her coming down the short aisle with an expression so open and unguarded that it was the most private thing she had ever seen in a public room. When Reverend Marsh said, "You may now greet your wife," Noah kissed her with such simplicity and warmth that Mary Sutton made a small sound beside her husband, and Carl put his arm around her and patted her shoulder. Outside the church in the December sun, Henry announced that Mr. Conroy needed a different name now. "What name?" Noah said, looking down at him. Henry thought about this with considerable seriousness. "You could just be Noah," he said at last, "because that's what Mama calls you now." "I could do that," Noah said. Henry seemed satisfied. He took Noah's hand on one side and Julia's on the other and walked between them to the waiting wagon, and Julia looked across the top of her son's head at the man she had married and felt the prairie wind and the winter sun on her face and thought, "Here it is. Here is the life that comes after grief. Here is the thing that does not replace what was lost but grows in the space that loss carved out, grows there specifically, grows there completely." They spent Christmas on the ranch, the three of them and Mary and Carl and the Sutton children, who were loud and cheerful and turned the house into something full and bright. Noah had built a simple wooden toy horse for Henry, sanded smooth and painted the brown of a real horse, and Henry's face when he opened it was something Julia kept in her memory like a pressed flower, flat and perfect and permanent. Winter that year was cold but not brutal. They managed the herd through January and February with the careful systems Noah had put in place, and lost only one steer to a cold snap in early February, which was a better outcome than most ranches in the county. The bank sent a letter in January that began, "Dear Mrs.," and then crossed out and began again, "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Conroy," and informed them that their account remained in good standing. Julia found this letter oddly moving. Aldous Pruett made one more approach, in late January, this time at the general store in Caldwell with Noah present, and spoke again of his offer, and Noah looked at him with a calm and level directness that was not threatening but was entirely clear, and said, "Mr. Pruett, this ranch is not for sale now or at any future time that I can foresee, and I think we'd all be better served if you redirected your attention to your own operation." Pruett looked at him for a moment and then nodded, a small tight nod, and left. And that was, more or less, the end of Aldous Pruett as an ongoing concern in their lives. He did not stop wanting the land, most likely, but he was a practical man, and practical men eventually stop investing effort in things that will not yield. Spring came back to the Fletcher Conroy Ranch, which was what Julia had begun calling it, which was what the signboard Noah had made and mounted on the gate said, "Fletcher Conroy," in neat letters, which Henry had watched being installed with the gravity of someone observing an important ceremony, with the particular extravagant rush of Kansas spring, the grass coming back green and urgent, the creek running high and cold and bright, the cottonwoods putting out their new leaves like small green fires. They brought on a new ranch hand in March, a young man of 20 named Eli, the son of a farming family near Wichita who wanted to learn the cattle business, and who had the specific useful quality of working hard and asking good questions. Noah took him on with the same patient directness with which he did everything, and Eli turned out to be a genuine asset, and in later years credited those years at the Fletcher Conroy Ranch with everything he eventually built for himself. In April, Julia told Noah she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen on a quiet Tuesday morning, directly, the way she told him everything. He stood very still for a moment, and then he set down the cup he was holding, and he crossed the kitchen to her and held her face in his hands and looked at her in a way that she would remember for the rest of her life. "Are you well?" he said first. "I am very well," she said. Then the thing that was happening in his face completed itself, and it was joy, unguarded and complete, and he kissed her forehead and her cheek and her mouth, and she laughed against him, and he held her. Henry was informed that evening. He received the news with the particular complex dignity of a 7-year-old who is adjusting to a new situation. "Will it be a boy?" he asked. "We don't know yet," Julia said. "I think it should be a boy," Henry said, "so I have someone to teach things to." "Girls can also be taught things," Noah said. Henry considered this. "That's true," he said. He seemed to decide this was an acceptable modification to his original position. "All right, either way." Their son was born in the first days of December 1883, which Julia thought was appropriate, her second December beginning coinciding with her first. They named him Thomas James Conroy. Thomas for his grandfather who had built the ranch and loved the land and left too soon, and James for Noah's father. Henry stood at the foot of the bed in his father's hat, now worn more ironically than with grief, for he had grown into the understanding that it was a keepsake rather than a substitute, and examined his new brother with the thorough assessment of someone who intends to take his responsibilities seriously. "He's very small," Henry said. "You were smaller," Noah said. Henry seemed skeptical about this, but willing to take it on faith. The ranch grew steadily through 1883 and 1884. By the spring of 1884, they had the 50 cattle that Julia had planned for, and had begun discussions about extending the water access to the north pasture that would enable the expansion to 60 the following year. They had hired a second hand, an older man named Walt who had retired from the cattle trails and wanted quieter work, and whose experience was considerable, and whose general disposition was that of someone who had seen enough of the world to stop being surprised by any of it. Mary Sutton and Julia remained close through all of it, the friendship adjusting and deepening as friendships do when they are the real kind that can bear the weight of change. Mary was at the house frequently, was present for Thomas James's birth, was the person Julia called on when she needed someone who knew her before all of this, before the grief and the struggle and the rebuilding. Mary had a gift for reminding Julia, gently and with humor, that the person she was now and the person she had been were the same person, that she had not been remade by loss but revealed by it. Julia thought about this sometimes in the evenings on the porch, which remained a place she returned to as a place of thinking. She thought about the woman who had driven into Caldwell in May of 1882 to meet a red-haired man with a cheerful disposition, and had met instead a dark-haired man with a serious face and steady eyes, and how completely she had not understood what that meant. She had sent for someone who would fix her fences and save her ranch. She had received that. She had received considerably more. In the summer of 1884, on a warm evening in July, with Thomas James asleep in the house, and Henry old enough now to be trusted with small chores in the barn before supper, Julia and Noah sat together on the porch steps, not in chairs, not in their usual positions, but together on the top step, side by side, his shoulder against hers, her head tipped back to look at the sky. The cottonwoods were in their full summer voice, and the creek was in its summer mood, and the prairie stretched out around them in every direction, theirs and known and full. "Do you think about Texas?" she said. "Sometimes," he said, "the green of it, but I don't miss it." "What do you miss?" she said. He thought about this. "Nothing that isn't here," he said. She pressed her shoulder against his. He put his arm around her, easy and natural, the way people touch each other when they have been touching for long enough that it has become the rest position. "I have been thinking," she said, "about whether we should apply for the Crenshaw acreage when it comes up for sale. Alderman said the estate is being settled and it'll likely go to auction by October." "The 20 acres to the northeast," Noah said. "It would give us access to the stream tributary," she said, "and would round out the north pasture boundary considerably." He was quiet, working through it. "It would put us extended again financially," he said. "For a year," she said. "After that it pays itself." He turned to look at her, and in the warm evening light she could see all of it in his face, the happiness that had taken up permanent residence there over the past 2 years, the respect and affection with which he looked at her, and also the particular pleasure of a man who genuinely admires the way someone else thinks. "All right," he said. "You're agreeing very easily," she said. "I usually agree with you eventually," he said. "I'm just shortening the process." She laughed. She leaned her head against his shoulder and he pulled her closer. Henry came out of the barn carrying a bucket with the exaggerated importance of someone performing a significant task, and saw his parents on the porch step, and observed them for a moment with 8-year-old assessment, and then came and sat on the step below them, and began telling them about something that had happened in school that day involving 2 boys and a frog, and a situation that had been considerably funnier, Henry felt, than their teacher Mr. Dawson had been willing to acknowledge. Noah listened with appropriate gravity and asked follow-up questions, and Julia listened and watched her son's face in the evening light, and the warm weight of her husband's arm was around her. And in the house behind them, Thomas James made a small sleeping sound and then was quiet again, and the coyotes were starting up somewhere out on the vast dark plain, and the stars were coming out one by one over the Kansas sky. The Fletcher Conroy Ranch got its signboard repainted the following spring, the letters a little larger, the wood a better quality. Noah let Henry help, which resulted in 2 of the letters being slightly uneven, which Noah declared was better for it, and which Julia agreed with, and which Henry was unreasonably proud of for the better part of a year. The Crenshaw acreage was purchased in November of 1884, at an auction in Caldwell that Noah attended and bid at with the same measured attention he brought to everything. He won it at a fair price, which was to say a price that was fair to both parties, because Noah Conroy had an instinctive distaste for winning at someone else's expense. He came home with the deed in his coat pocket and put it on the kitchen table, and Julia looked at it for a long moment. "I hired you," she said. "I thought I was hiring someone to repair fences and manage 31 cattle." "I know," he said. "I did not think it would look like this," she said. "What does it look like?" he said. She looked around the kitchen, the well-used table, the good iron stove, the hooks where Henry's hat and Thomas James's small coat hung beside Noah's own, the windowsill where she had started growing an herb garden that summer because she had the time for it now, which itself was a measure of something. "Like a life," she said, "like the one I thought I had lost." He crossed to her and he held her face in his hands the way he had done when she told him about Thomas James, and he looked at her steadily and with all of it visible, all the feeling he had been so careful with in those first months, none of it careful now, all of it just present and certain. "Not lost," he said. "Continued." She put her hands over his. "Continued," she agreed. There was a particular quality to the life they built in those years, something that people in Caldwell noticed and commented on without always being able to say what it was exactly. It was partly the ranch itself, which had gone from a failing operation to a sound and growing one in a way that people in agricultural communities appreciate because they understand what it costs. It was partly the way Noah had integrated himself into the community, not quickly or with self-promotion, but steadily, and with the particular currency of a man who keeps his word and does what he says and shows up when he is needed. He had helped 2 neighboring families through difficult patches with advice and practical assistance, had served on the county committee that organized the annual market, had participated in the community efforts to maintain the Caldwell Road through the winter of 1883 when it was in genuine danger of becoming impassable. He was not a man who needed to be noticed. He was the kind of man who got noticed anyway, because the work was visible. Julia had her own standing, which had always been there but which had shifted from the Fletcher widow, poor thing, to Julia Conroy, who runs that operation north of town. She had joined the county cooperative that organized collective purchasing of supplies, had helped Mary Sutton establish a small lending library of the kind that Mary had been trying to start for 3 years, and which finally had a proper home in the back of the general store, had on 2 occasions been the person that other women in difficult circumstances had come to, because she was known to understand difficult circumstances and to give practical rather than sentimental advice. She did not talk about what it had been like in those first years very often, but when she did, she told it honestly. The fear, the bank letters, the slow accumulation of smaller and smaller options, the way grief and worry had made the world feel very narrow and the future feel very contingent. And then the stagecoach on a Thursday afternoon in May, and a man she had not sent for stepping down into the Caldwell afternoon light. She did not tell it as a story about being rescued. She told it as a story about 2 people who found each other at the exact moment when both of them needed to find something, and who had been honest and careful enough with each other to let it become what it was. In the spring of 1886, 4 years after that Thursday afternoon at the stage station, Julia discovered she was expecting again. She was 32 years old, which she informed Noah was an entirely reasonable age for such things, when he expressed the kind of concerned attentiveness that she found touching and gently unnecessary. Thomas James was 2.5 and had the particular focused energy of a very young child who has decided that the world exists primarily for his direct investigation. Henry was 10 and had grown into a serious and capable boy who followed Noah around the ranch with the same focused attention that he had given to his father before, and whom Noah was teaching with the same patient honesty. The acknowledgement of what Noah was to Henry had happened gradually and without drama, the way the most important things in family life tend to happen. Henry had two fathers now in the way that loss and love together sometimes enable. One who had given him the beginning of himself and would always be part of him, and one who was present in the daily living of his life, who taught him and talked to him, and was there when the difficult things happened. Noah never tried to replace Thomas Fletcher and never needed to. He was simply, steadily, entirely there. On a morning in early April, with the new grass coming up sharp and green along the creek bank and the cottonwoods just beginning their spring extravagance, Julia stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and watched Noah and Henry walking the north fence line together. The man's head bent to the boys while Henry pointed at something, and the quality of it, the ordinary daily sufficiency of it, moved through her like music. She thought about the woman she had been on that Tuesday in the spring of 1882 when the letter arrived, exhausted and afraid, and running so hard on determination alone that she had not noticed how thin the ground under her feet had become. She thought about that Friday when she had decided to send for someone, and the Thursday when the wrong man had stepped off the right stagecoach. He was not the man she had sent for. He was considerably more than that. Their daughter was born in October of 1886, and they named her Alina Rose, and she arrived in the world with a disposition of complete certainty about her own importance that caused Noah to look at Julia with an expression of delighted recognition. "She is exactly like you," he said. "She is," Julia said contentedly. Henry was 10 and had been waiting with dignified patience for weeks, and when he was brought in to see his new sister he looked at her for a long time and then said, with the gravity of someone revising an earlier position, "Girls are actually fine." Thomas James, at 2.5, was largely indifferent to the baby and considerably more interested in the fact that there was unexpected cake. The ranch had 62 cattle by the end of 1886. Eli had gone on to his own operation near Dodge City, which Noah and Julia heard about with the particular satisfaction of people who have been part of something that continued past themselves. Walt worked at the ranch until 1888, when his joints told him firmly that he was done with outdoor labor, and he retired to his sister's house in Caldwell and was replaced by a young man named Sam, who was the son of a black farming family who had homesteaded 30 miles west and who was, Julia told Noah on Sam's first day, the hardest-working 20-year-old she had ever encountered in her life. She was not wrong about that. Sam worked at the Fletcher Conroy Ranch for 8 years, and in the process learned enough to take over the management of his family's growing operation, and the friendship between the families that developed over those years was one of the things Julia valued most in the later years of her life, when she thought about what the ranch had grown into and what it had grown from. The prairie changed around them, as it had been changing across the decade. The open range, which had been the defining fact of the cattle industry through the 70s, was being replaced by the particular logic of fences and property lines that the growth of population and the expansion of farming necessitated. The cattle drives, which Noah had known intimately, were already becoming something that old hands talked about in the past tense. The wild, open, lawless quality that had characterized the Kansas frontier of the 60s and early 70s had given way to something more settled, more constrained, more like the ordinary life of any agricultural community, with its church and its school and its county politics and its communal rhythms. Noah sometimes stood at the edge of the north pasture in the evenings and looked west, where the sky stayed light the longest, and Julia knew he was thinking about the earlier years, the wider years, the particular freedom of a life lived entirely in the open. She did not ask him if he missed it the way she might have in the beginning, when she was still learning to read him. She knew now that he held that part of himself the way she held Thomas Fletcher, with honesty and completeness, as something that had been real and had shaped her and was not replaced, but simply preceded what came after. He turned from the western sky and came back across the grass to the porch where she was sitting, and sat beside her, and she handed him a cup of coffee, and they listened to the evening together. In 1889, when Alina Rose was nearly 3 and could walk and speak her opinions with a fluency that regularly astonished everyone, and Thomas James was 5 and had developed his father's dark hair and his mother's stubborn assessment of the world, and Henry was 13 and had begun to be taller than Julia and was quietly proud of this. Noah came to the kitchen table one evening with something in his manner that was different, a particular quiet readiness. "I have been thinking," he said, "about the land registration." She looked at him. "The current registration is fine," she said. "It's registered in your name," he said, "which is correct. It is your land." "It is our land," she said. He looked at her. "I know," he said, "but legally, Noah," she said. He stopped. "It is our land," she said. "Whatever the paperwork says, you know that." "I know it," he said. "I wanted you to say it." She reached across the table and took his hand. "It is our land," she said again, and the word "our" sat between them with a particular weight, the weight of everything it had taken to get to the point where it was simply true. He turned her hand over in his and looked at it for a moment. "I never thought," he said quietly, not quite to her and not quite to himself, "that I would have anything like this." "Neither did I," she said. "Not again." The cottonwoods were moving outside the window in the September evening light, and the children's voices came faintly from somewhere in the house or yard. Alina's high insistent note, Thomas James's lower retort, and from the barn the sound of Henry working with some piece of equipment. The scrape and turn of a 16-year-old who had decided the world was a serious place, and that he intended to be equal to it. Julia looked at her husband's face in the warm kitchen light, the silver that had come into his dark hair at the temples over the years, the lines that weather and work and a great deal of living had deepened around his eyes and mouth, the particular quality of his attention when it was on her, which had not changed from the first evening on the porch when she had not been able to stop herself looking back. She thought about the letter that had arrived on a Tuesday in the spring of 1882. She thought about the Friday when she had decided to send for someone. She thought about the Thursday afternoon at the stage station, the dust and the heat, and the wrong man stepping down from the right coach, and the particular quality of surprise she had felt, and the particular quality of steadiness she had encountered. She thought about the letter that had not arrived in time. She thought about how the most important things in her life had arrived by accident, and how accident was perhaps not quite the right word for the way the world arranged its most essential deliveries. "Noah," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am very glad you came," she said. His hand tightened on hers. His eyes were the gray-green of creek water in shadow, and they were warm with everything that had accumulated between them over 7 years. All the work and the weather and the hard winters and the good springs and the children and the evenings on the porch and the dances and the kitchen table conversations, and all the 10,000 ordinary moments that constitute the substance of a life shared between two people who have chosen each other truly. "So am I," he said. Outside, Alina's voice announced something with the full authority of a 3-year-old who has found a frog. Thomas James's voice confirmed the frog's existence. Henry's voice, dropping now toward a man's register, carried across the yard telling them both to put it down before dinner. The horse in the barn shifted and settled. The creek ran on in its ancient patient course along the eastern edge of the Fletcher Conroy ranch, which was prosperous and growing and entirely, completely, finally whole. The stars came out over Kansas in their extravagant way, and the man and the woman sat together in the warm kitchen light, and the land lay around them in all directions, known and cared for and alive, and the life they had built from the materials of loss and luck and work and honesty was full, and it was theirs, and it was more than enough. It was everything.